let me tell you what I really think. We are at a civilisational moment in the West. We are at a civilisational moment. And I'm not sure we're going to make it, but I don't want to be questioned for want of trying, and I don't think anybody else in this room does either. Let's realise the stakes are very great.
Tonight's debate is very important, and I'm so pleased we've got such a full house here. As you may be aware, both sides of politics have recently declared that the upcoming election will be a referendum on nuclear power. That's fantastic news for us here at the CIS, because the last 6 months have been focused very heavily on the issue of nuclear energy, on the energy transition. First speaker tonight's going to be my colleague, Aidan Morrison. Aidan joined us about 6 months ago. We're going to get him to come and explain some of the excellent work that he's been doing. Then we're going to bring up the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Jo Anderson, to give a bit of context to the debate, to talk about some of the bigger issues. With that, I'm going to bring up the Director of the Energy Program, Aidan Morrison, to explain everything about nuclear power.
Tonight, what I want to be arguing is that we must rethink the energy transition, and we have to do that after we've had an important, honest conversation. That's the conversation about cost. I'm going to tell you tonight why that conversation is important, how we've managed to get this far along in the debate without yet having it, and to finish, I want to touch on where I think we might change our trajectory if we actually have that conversation we need to have. But first, just to begin with, why not have the conversation about cost? And this is a point that I get thrown to me all the time whenever myself or the team expose on social media a new element of the cost that has not been properly discussed or has been hidden. People say, oh, but compared to the cost of doing nothing about climate change, that's trivial. So we should just spend it anyway. And this points to a core question. How do we balance the costs and the risks of climate change emerging in the future with the costs borne today to avoid it? I'd like to take the question very seriously. But there are two real reasons why I think this argument, which could be used to excuse spending anything, any amount of money on any cost, is misplaced. First is that climate change, whilst a problem, still isn't the only problem in the world. There are many other challenges and opportunities that do and will continue to demand our dollars. The second reason is that climate change might be a very big problem. Big enough that we'll wish to have more dollars than we are ever likely to easily muster to solve it. And because of that, we cannot afford to waste a single dollar in our efforts. If we don't measure what we're spending, we won't manage it either. Let's spend just a moment on the science. I'll tell you very briefly what I think is quite clear, and I think I'll tell you what is less clear and why that leads to such a difficult and polarised debate. Certainly a very clear mechanism by which CO2 in the atmosphere warms the planet. And there's a pretty obvious way in which we might have released quite a bit of CO2 into the atmosphere, burning fossil fuels. I'm not here to dispute that we're having an impact and affecting the climate. But the more difficult question is around just how bad that effect is and how soon the consequences become, well, bad enough to do something about it now. And measuring how big that something is, how much we want to spend right today, is a very difficult question indeed. And this becomes a sensitive topic. Opinions vary on this greatly. And there are voices that decry any variance, claiming that any hesitation on any expenditure amounts to a complete denial of the science. Now, I'm not one of those voices. I know enough about science to know that when done well, there often is uncertainty, and there needs to be acknowledgement of that. And in this case, there's certainly some uncertainty about the precision of the relationship between carbon and temperature. It's called the climate sensitivity. There's quite a lot more uncertainty about exactly how life on Earth responds to the temperature as well. It's an enormous and complex system. Lots of feedback loops, ocean currents, ecological responses. And this uncertainty takes us to a really difficult, uncomfortable place. We're assessing the unknown. We're balancing probabilities, risks. Now, uncertainty is not a good reason to do nothing, but it sure complicates things. Hesitation, division, these are dangerous things in the tribe. And I think tribal animals, ultimately, it appears we are. We're seeking an action plan that is clearly the right thing to do, despite knowing that we don't see everything in the future clearly. And this is why I think significant institutions, personalities, particularly in the media, in politics, and also in education, tend to, I think, essentially oversample from the extremes of the probability distribution. It's a strategy to pretend there's more certainty than there is. Some people suggest there's no link at all between carbon, that we're having no impact on the climate, and that we shouldn't do anything to reduce our carbon emissions. Others will suggest that there is such an imminent ecological and societal collapse just a few years ahead of us that absolutely any expenditure is warranted. I think most people, including myself, fall somewhere between these extremes. But that leaves us in the hardest of all places, evaluating future risks, uncertainties, probabilities, trying to find a certain course of action that we can build consensus around with imperfect information. So how do we do that? I don't think it's worthwhile simply shouting at those with a different perception of the risks and wishing they had the same perceptions as we do. There'll always be those for whom the risk of climate change looms less large. And it might not be because they don't think there's any risk at all. It might simply be because they have other struggles in life that dominate their decision-making at that time. It's still hard to earn a job, keep a living, pay the mortgage, worry about healthcare, secure retirement. These are real concerns, and they deserve real respect. We clearly have people in our society today for whom the risk of climate change looms extremely large indeed and demands urgent attention, even at significant, perhaps overwhelming cost. But I would argue that seeing the threat of climate-induced societal collapse doesn't obviate the need for the conversation about cost. It actually makes it even more important, more urgent. Because if the risk of disaster is truly upon us, the efforts required to meet that challenge will be enormous. And we need to spend every dollar wisely. So I think that being deeply engaged, honest, open about the cost should be a prerequisite step for the dialogue for both sides of politics, both sides of the extreme. Just as we've seen recently the emerged consensus, and I've seen this a week or so ago at Energy Week in Australia, that for developers of new renewable infrastructure, the approach you have to take to win the social license is to be open about the challenges, open about the imposition, the noise, the cost, the use of land. You have to acknowledge the genuine pain and then go on to explain why it's important, explain how you've tried to minimise all the costs and impacts, and for the societal good, a certain development still must place. This is how people have agreed now they need to win social licence in the country to build major infrastructure. I'd just like to see the same approach with winning the economic licence. Sadly, though, I think the trust has been totally broken. Instead of honestly acknowledging costs, a childish game has emerged where we equate the costs with investment and make out as though climate action is actually some hidden cost relief program to bring down your energy bills and bring down your household bills as well. The costs have simply been hidden. Do you think that in the massive effort to create the integrated system plan, thousands of pages, many tens of thousands of man-hours, modelling efforts, huge computers, do you think they couldn't come up with a future projected energy bill and answer the question that is on the lips of absolutely every Australian today? How are we going to pay for this? And who pays for this? Of course it's possible. Talk to many modellers who know it is, some who've run the numbers. It's just not being shared in the publications where it should be. A recent report we've published here at the Centre for Independent Studies, we've outlined 6 fundamental flaws in the major documents that support the energy transition, namely CSIRO's Gen Cost and the Integrated System Plan by the Australian Energy Market Operator. Now, it's our contention that rather than having the honest conversation about costs, these documents have been used to build up a rather undeserved aura of economic superiority around renewable energy. And when we scratch the surface and dig down, this aura really depends on 2 very specific individual claims. First, it's the claim that renewable energy is the lowest cost system. This is the claim that CSIRO's Gen Cost definitely makes. Lower even than the former system we've had today, relying on coal. And the second is that we are currently busy building the lowest cost version of that renewable energy system. That's the claim of AEMO's Integrated System Plan, the ISP. On inspection, neither of these claims add up. the aura of economic superiority is entirely undeserved. I'm going to share a couple of very hard truths. Confronting, but I'd contend definitely true. The lowest cost contribution to a reliable energy system is coal. It always was. We haven't forgotten how to dig it up and burn it. We're nowhere near running out. It's still the cheapest today. It probably will be in 5 years, will be in 10, probably will be in 100. Second hard truth, the highest cost contribution to a reliable energy system, rooftop solar. A solar of any kind contributes very little to a reliable energy system unless it's paired with massive amounts of storage. But the one way to make it truly ineffective, a truly horrendously costly investment, is to take a nice large solar farm and shatter it into 1,000 tiny pieces, remove all the single axis tracking, smatter it on untuned angles on the roofs of private owners, which are partly shaded by trees, and give control of it to a disinterested owner who has no information and access about what's happening in the energy grid, and then try to bid and entice them to give control back with various carrots and sticks and tariffs and incentives and rewards to someone that can see what's happening in the energy grid. Somewhere in there, you've got to buy some batteries and a smart meter. And so if these things are true, how have we landed with our dominant documents telling us the exact opposite of this? I think there's just a dire risk that we've fit the economic analysis to match our perceptions of the social license. Coal is in the sin bin and rooftop solar is sporting the halo. Honest analysis here has simply been the loser. How did we get here? Well, it's crystal clear in CSIRO's Gen Cost, which is the official document claiming that coal is now more expensive than firmed renewables. It's all in the fine print. Key words like new coal has to be greenfield with new connections from a mine up to 100 kilometres away to a source. There's no consideration of refurbishments of old sites, no considerations of extensions, brownfield sites just next to existing ones, no consideration of the standard subcritical coal-fired power stations, which we have many of, no consideration of the supercritical coal-powered stations like our latest one at Cogan Creek. There's no consideration of ultra-supercritical, which is the current state-of-the-art coal that's being built in Asia. No, there is only consideration of a single, isolated, greenfield, advanced, ultra-supercritical coal-fired plant, the design of which, by the admission of the engineering company that was commissioned to this report, has not yet been built anywhere in the world. This coal plant will operate at temperatures and pressures that would make a nuclear reactor look like a warm bath. And finally, of course, the coal price is not taken from a decent average of what coal price actually costs. It's taken from the peak of the war-induced crisis that came out of Ukraine and is assumed not to resolve. The lowest of the low prices are not taken. It's the average of the lows, but they've taken the highest of the high prices of those export-exposed mines to give us the span for the current cost of coal. These are absolutely crystal clear biases in the report. It's not a picture of what reflects reality. It's simply been tuned and selected to fit a narrative. The layering of political judgment onto the economic costings is on naked display in the report. Now, in response to some specific questions that CIS raised, CSIRO has written, some stakeholders, that's us, take a view that although Australia has bipartisan commitment for net zero emissions by 2050, the highest greenhouse gas emitting options should remain on the table. The deployment of new coal has low plausibility given its high emission intensity. A high efficiency design brings it closer to being plausible. Now, I don't necessarily want to advocate for expanding coal. I just want Gen Cost to be the product that it says it is on the label. And if you read the website, that is an accurate, policy and technology neutral cost estimate. The logic they've outlined that first points to politics, to then point to plausibility, to justify taking a view of how you'd cost something is the exact opposite of that. Now, if we're not advocating for more coal, why on earth does any of this matter? Shouldn't we just ignore it? Well, I think because truth matters. The lived experience of so many Australians my age and older is that Australia used to have very reliable, very cheap electricity. And the cheap part, at least, is changing. Now, there are two possibilities. Either coal under our feet has suddenly become much, much more expensive, or The addition of weather-dependent renewable energy to the system has introduced more costs much faster than it's been able to relieve other costs. I'll let you figure out which one it is. Now, what about our beloved rooftop solar, which I win no friends for betraying? How could we come to believe that this is the best value contribution we can make? Now, most people learn reality through the hip pocket nerve, and we've given subsidies and distortive tariff structures that have created the impression for rooftop solar owners that they're saving money. But reality is that it saves the whole system frightfully little, mostly just a little bit of fuel burnt. The rest of the system and the rest of the costs have to remain in place. They have to remain in place for when the sun doesn't shine and, of course, the wind doesn't blow. So this illusion of saving money is that we've taught the population to understand that solar does. It's really only achieved by shifting costs off one user's bill onto another's, or reducing the volume of electricity by and hiking up the price of the remaining volume that you consume. The energy nerds have a word for this. It's called the load shape premium. Now, I think that the introduction of export tariffs recently, where solar owners get charged money to send their excess power to the grill, is just one of very many bitter pills of truth that are going to be swallowed by the Australian public in the near future. You can hide the costs for a while, but you can't hide them forever. What about for us boffins who do sophisticated models, like the integrated system plan? How do they miss the problems of rooftop solar? The answer is even simpler. They just don't include any of the cost. Ponder that. Consumer energy resources, the key words they hide behind. That's rooftop solar, home batteries, electric vehicles, are modelled in the integrated system plan as providing electricity. In fact, the CEO of AEMO, Daniel Westerman, just a couple of weeks ago at Australian Energy Week said, these consumer energy resources will be an indispensable part of the future energy system. Quote from the CEO, indispensable. He's right. Rooftop solar will be the largest single generation asset by installed capacity. Home batteries, the largest single storage asset by installed capacity. And remember, the distribution network, which connects those, is also the largest network asset and the biggest component of your bill today. None of this is included as a cost. It's modelled, it's assumed to exist. It's just not modelled as a cost. Now, we've pointed out this, of course, in our formal submissions and in our paper, The 6 Fundamental Flaws, and I would contend this is a very fundamental flaw indeed. No reasonable person, when producing something that's meant to optimise overall system costs, can say that their optimisation is robust, rigorous, really any use at all, if you've left out not some tiny little cost, but the biggest costs in the system. Particularly, to justify doing so, you've simply said it's going to be borne by consumers for whom you're meant to be optimising the costs in the first place. Costs don't disappear in reality, they just disappear from the documents and disappear from the discussion. Now, there are other flaws which might rival this. Costs aren't just omitted, carbon is also omitted. In our pursuit to reach net zero, Scope 3 is the technical word used to justify not considering any of the carbon embodied in the steel, silicon, lithium, copper that's required to actually make this energy transition work. Now, ardent advocates for climate action should be deeply concerned about this. But I'm hearing crickets. No one seems to be worried about us exporting that carbon to another country. These documents also obscure the fact that the assumption of perfect foresight of the weather is baked into the code, literally hardwired into the models used to produce these projections. They're inherently overfit, kind of shrink-wrapping the required installations to fit the exact weather patterns year to year. And we can see in reports instances of this, where the ISP has modelled building just-in-time gas capacity, up to 4 gigawatts in a single year, after which, once the La Nina has passed, they steadily retire that gas capacity after that. Now, in reality, we'll have to be ready for any weather year, every year. And the system that is ready for that costs an awful lot more. In particular, we're going to need a lot more reliable gas capacity constantly available for when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. The models we currently have, the ones that underpin the integrated system plan, they can't value the certainty that gas provides because they don't have any uncertainty. they have perfect foresight of the weather. Now, this has a profound impact on one of the key parts of the energy transition that is causing enormous social strife and doesn't get the economic attention that it deserves. That's the transmission lines. Sure, you've heard it said, there's no transition without transmission. Simple catchphrase used by our energy minister and many others. But not all transmission is actually good value. Some, of course, is required to physically connect a generator to a load. But the volume that we're asking for in the integrated system plan is for a very different purpose. It's to provide massive interconnection between states, between different regions, to provide insurance value for when the weather is poor in one region in the hope that it's better at that time in another region. This is the transmission that's being advanced under projects such as VNI West and HumeLink with all haste. And it's these projects to have any benefit at all in their cost-benefit analysis. And it's quite a struggle to get them to stack up and just tip their toe over the line. They rely on that extra bit of gas capacity being saved by their existence. This is the gas that I'm quite sure, if we solved our perfect foresight problem, we would have to build in any case. In other words, these interconnectors are a waste. They're massively antagonising regional communities, and they won't actually serve any serious economic purpose. And there's one more problem with the cost-benefit analyses for transmission, like VNI West and HumeLink. They depend on enormous sunk costs being simply excluded from their cost-benefit analysis. The biggest one is Snowy 2.0. Yes, of course, we've spent about $5 billion, but there's another $7 billion more yet to spend. That's more than we ever planned on spending in the first place. We can save more by stopping now than we ever planned on spending on that project. To continue is the very purest form of a sunk cost fallacy. And this is what I think has gone so wrong about the integrated system plan. It's envisioned as a coordinating document, enabling the very best, most efficient plan, incorporating different resources that are balanced and optimized in their uptake across different state boundaries. This is the vision outlined by Dr. Alan Finkel. It's a logical, defensible proposition in defense of developing the least cost version of a low carbon system. But what's happened to the ISP is exactly the opposite. Instead of demanding that the whole system incorporate just the best, most efficient projects from each state, the ISP now pours concrete around projects that are simply declared by state or federal governments with no whole-of-system cost optimisation. The very highest irony is in the Queensland state government's Energy and Jobs Plan. In the economic modelling commissioned to Ernst & Young, this calls out the scenario that's based on the integrated system plan, which is our coordinating document, the uncoordinated approach, and uses the comparison for a new plan that Queensland provides to invest in even more wind and solar that is not yet called for or required under the integrated system plan. So quite simply, I put it to you that the claim that we are currently building the least cost version of a renewable energy system lies in tatters when we subject it to close scrutiny. The claim that a weather-dependent system is the least cost of all options has never, in my opinion, been properly established in fact. The fact is, weather-dependent systems just don't scale well. Easy to have a little bit, while you've got the rest of the system still standing there to back it up. But we're at the fork in the road in Australia. We're struggling terribly to actually retire the rest of the other system that is currently still there on standby. And every additional bit of weather-dependent energy will now have to be moved further around the country or around the clock or around the calendar to be useful. The honeymoon for renewables is over. That's why I think we need a rethink. Once we've had the honest conversation about costs of renewables, we'll realise that we can't afford to exhaust ourselves just decarbonising electricity. Arguably, we shouldn't even break a sweat on electricity, because decarbonising the other 70% of our emissions, things like steel, cement, aviation, international shipping, fertilisers, all the other things we depend on in society, they will be harder. Electricity should be the easy part. That's why I think we need to turn to nuclear. Nuclear, in many ways, is the inverse of renewables. It's quite hard to get started, requires a huge upfront cost. It's a different technology. We have to have the institutions to support it. But once we've established it Once we've learnt those hard skills, it scales up beautifully in the system and lasts an extremely long time and becomes eventually a very cheap source of electricity once the initial investment is paid off. Things that cost a bit more now but provide a sustainable path to a long-term, scalable, low-carbon, sustainable electricity system is exactly what's called for. That's why we must rethink this energy transition. Thank you.
We're very fortunate this evening to have John Anderson to come and join us and give his perspective on this. I mean, I think most of you probably have either met John or know about John. He was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. His Conversations podcast series, if you're not a subscriber of that yet, you're missing out. I think we're very lucky to have a statesman of this calibre who's been around public policy development for literally decades, who has the perspective not only of someone who's been in Canberra, but also a person who's had to make a living for himself. I think, John, you're a farmer now, right? So with someone with that level of expertise, I think we're in for a very interesting little context-setting scene for nuclear energy and the transition. So, John, can you give us some thoughts and then we'll transition to a conversation?
Well, Simon, thank you very much for those kind words. And friends, good to be with you. It is very important indeed that we have the opportunity to try and acquaint ourselves with the realities confronting us at what is essentially an economic and civilisational moment for the West and for this country in particular. This is very serious stuff. Can I begin by saying thank you, Aidan? There'll be opportunities to do that later, I know, but I've known Aidan for some years. We first crossed paths considering nuclear submarines, and I discovered that he is, in the words of a friend of mine, a nuclear superbrain. And you've seen tonight something of his clarity of thinking and ability to unpack what are very complicated issues. So mark that name. Aidan Morrison is going to have a lot of value to contribute to this country if, it's a big if, we are mature enough to recognise we'll never get good policy without a decent debate. And that's what we need so urgently in this country. Well, this winning out of ideology over the real interests of the people, I put it to you, presents us with a situation where if we're not careful, we are going to manage an unholy trifecta. We are going to destroy the first requirement when it comes to power, which is reliability of supply. Many of you will have toured parts of the world where you don't have uninterrupted power supplies. It's worse than expensive power. You won't have any industry left if you don't have reliable power. Secondly, we've already done away with and we're likely to massively exacerbate the problem of overly expensive, uncompetitive power prices by global standards. The third trifecta is we're not going to go within a bull's roar of meeting these targets. It's not going to happen. I haven't met an engineer or scientist yet who thinks the targets are realistic or can be met. At the same time as we manage that trifecta, we're going to see the cost of living prices increase forever. One of the great dishonesties here is that many of the activists and ideologues driving this transition process in such a messy way is they don't want you to know the truth, which is that they think we should all live at a much more modest standard. They think we are the enemy of Mother Earth, of Gaia. We're the problem. There should be fewer of us, and we should return to I won't use any crude language, a much more modest living approach to living. And we're not being told that. The dishonesty at the heart of all of this is extraordinary. We won't learn from history. That's a tragedy because all sorts of nonsense flows into the void when we don't know our own history. Nor will we learn from what's happening globally. Where is the evidence that high levels of penetration of renewable energy around the world bring power prices down? Where is it? Are we so much cleverer in this country that we're going to be able to do what no one else has done? Why is it that the countries that have high levels of nuclear capacity have cheaper power than those who are hell-bent on renewables? Again, are we so clever that somehow or other we can reinvent things here locally? And memo to smart people in the ALP, forget about going to Burgundy. It's in France. You might come back with 3 eyes. I mean, how childish is this stuff? You want a bit of an example of, though, where we're headed? It's California. Woke California. Woke California now is home to what Joel Kotkin calls an increasingly feudal society. A very narrow band of astoundingly wealthy people who can afford every luxury belief you can think of, by the way, in Silicon Valley, wealthier in absolute terms and in relative terms than any other human beings who have ever walked the surface of the earth. And then there's the rest, because they, in the name of emissions targets, have basically driven out their manufacturing sector. It's gone to dreadful red states like Texas and Florida and Arizona and China. That's a red state too, I suppose, isn't it? So manufacturing's gone, the middle class is gone, and just stop and think about this for a moment. In the same state where you've got the world's wealthiest people living in great privilege and isolation, 80% of the new emerging jobs are low paid. And those of you who know anything about America know that that's really pretty horrible stuff. And Joel Kotkin says, give it another 15 years and California's going to look like Cuba, except they won't be old Chevrolets and Fords. They'll be old Toyotas because they're the only things that hang together if you drive them into the earth 5 times over. That's his view. My final comment before we start a dialogue with Aidan is this. You cannot get good public policy out of a bad debate. It doesn't happen. That's why what Aidan and his team are doing here with the CIS, and I salute the CIS and the work that you're doing. It's so important for the public domain now. You can't get good public policy without a good debate. The biggest single thing you could do if you believed in integrity and a decent debate in Australia now is lift the ban. Lift the ban on nuclear. You'll quickly get to the costings then. I read, from apparatchiks of the government at the moment that, of course, no one in the financial sector will touch this stuff. Well, of course they won't. They know it's a waste of time. There's a ban. Why would you sharpen pencils and try and work out what it would cost to build nuclear capacity in Australia while there's a ban in place? So how about a little bit of courage? How about a little bit of integrity? How about admitting that this is one heck of a conundrum and lift that ban, and then we'll know a great deal more. Let me finally say on the issue of costings, I was reflecting today with John Howard that at one stage he wanted to honour Donald Bradman. None of you will be surprised by that. He wanted a modest amount of money to be approved through the Budgetary Committee, which I was on, to commemorate, I can't remember exactly what the anniversary was, of one of the Don's great moments. It was for $2.5 million. Went through the whole rigour of the NSC was security, ERC. And we generously gave the Prime Minister $2.5 million to honour Donald Bradman. He had to demonstrate that it was worth doing. Today, can I say, is a moral outrage to say that no matter what it costs, it will be cheaper than not acting. The simple fact of the matter is that while the science on climate change might be reasonably well known, the modelling on the impacts is completely unknown. It's all low confidence. That's all in the international panel's stuff. Just as is the acknowledgement that it's not the end of the earth. It just means greater challenges. But our young people have been totally captured by the catastrophisation of this issue, again mitigating against calm, reasoned debate. So when it comes to costings, I just say to you that I think the biggest thing that's left out of the costings, frankly, is the potential for damage to our economy. So we talk narrowly about the costs of energy, the transition and what the energy it produces might cost, without recognising that we can do a California on ourselves, drive all the industry out, and then we'll really know what cost is. And so will all those young people who are saying at the moment the cost of living is keeping them out of houses and assets. So this is serious stuff. Thank you so much to the CIS for making this debate possible. And to Aidan, we're about to have a discussion now, and then we'll open it up for the work that he and his team are doing. This is nationally important stuff. Broadly speaking, if I'm right, the first Gen cost report from AMIO and the CSIRO dismissed nuclear. It's 6 times as expensive. in a bouquet to you people and the CIS, you were able to very quickly establish that the reasoning for that, behind that, was absolutely ridiculous. So they went away and did it again and said, oh no, it's not 6 times as expensive, it's only twice. That's a pretty big variation. But then as Judith Sloan pointed out, and I think she probably got her material from here, and if you think I'm pumping these people up, I am, because I want everyone to understand this is the hub where the good arguments are coming from, that the CSIRO put their name to a report that said that nuclear energy is only twice as expensive. But by the way, this is based on the idea that solar panels and turbines will last for roughly double what they last, and that nuclear powers will last, plants will only last 45 years, whereas the norm is 90. And did the CSIRO really say that and put their name to it?
Look, they did. I mean, that's the things that you can get away with if you put a sort of bit of fine print and explain something. And that's something that I sort of battled the first time that I challenged CSIRO publicly, is that I didn't really discover and get truly outraged with what they had done when I read it the first time. This was the sunk cost argument, when they'd said they'd costed the integration of renewables, but treated all the integration investments up to 2030 as sunk. So 7 years of our biggest investment in the transmission in the transition was sunk cost. And I read it once in about page 50, and they said they'd done it, and I didn't quite believe it. When they got to page 90, which was an appendix written to the last guy who'd complained about this, saying in 2 pages of lengthy kind of, yes, we definitely did that and we definitely think it's okay, then I realized something was terribly wrong. That they could write back and pretty much with just throw an extra few pages about it and say, yes, this outrageous thing that seems ridiculous, to say all these things are sunk costs we haven't spent. It's the power of paperwork. Literally to say, yes, there's a problem. Have we solved it? No. Have we thought about it? Here's a few more pages, another report, another consultation panel, something else. Just throw volume at it and pretend you've dealt with the problem is astounding. And so I was amazed, and I'm glad that I took it very seriously. And since then as well, if you find the pressure point and absolutely throw the book at them, they move. But their first defense always is to say, oh no, we thought about it and it's okay. That was the thing that Zoe exposed so well in the excellent video. It went viral, and I think we can honestly claim was the tipping point for going from 6 times to 3 times. Is we just video exposed the reason they had given, and they had a reason. They said, oh, we don't think that large scale nuclear works in Australia. Asked them exactly why, forced them to spell it out, and it was just such a humiliating explanation of 6 years ago. Oh, someone said this, and we never thought to question it again. We just rolled with it, and you have to absolutely press twice on the pressure points before they'll admit that something could be improved. In this case, they have. But yes, it's astounding, absolutely astounding how much you have to wade through the burden of paperwork. Just throwing back more pages, saying, "Oh, we thought about it. Here's another reason. Considered it a bit more, but didn't actually solve the problem." So it's a painful experience. We're making progress.
Tell us about, it sounds very sophisticated, and I'm sure it's meant to impress us, the integrated system plan. You touched on it, but we've had some major flurry of activity around that in Canberra today. What's it mean? What should we take away from it?
Yeah, we should take nothing away from it, is the short answer. The integrated system plan is I think of it as the spider at the center of the web. It is the thing that all references point to. The method they use in the integrated system plan is what CSIRO says they have shadowed in their analysis too. So it's the kind of ultimate source of truth in the Australian debate. And it's portrayed very readily as sort of showing that we can and will achieve certain targets. As a measure of what is realistic, AEMO, the market operators integrated system plan, is often touted as being, this shows it's possible. Here's the path that says it works. However, the thing that we've discovered and it took a little bit of digging to discover this, by the way, we've discovered in the last week or so is that the trajectory that the integrated system plan puts us on, not the trajectory, they map different scenarios, different worldviews. All the trajectories, all the scenarios, the integrated system plan, are forced to meet the 82% renewable energy target that the Labor government is committed to in 2030. And so that's a target that, as you pointed out, no one serious I know, literally no one. I found an ABC post that cited Nexa Advisory and Rystad Renewable Energy and all the guys that wouldn't normally be agreeing with me on many things, saying that we're headed to maybe 60. No one I know thinks this is realistic. And yet the integrated system plan, which should be our main roadmap, our most objective source of truth, considers no other world, than us having to meet that. So it's evolved from being a credible, objective, diversified look at possible realities to being basically just a force-fit model of what has to happen to meet one political imperative target. So what do we do with it? What do we make of it? I just think nothing. I just think that it's lost its primary purpose now. And unfortunately, it's railroaded us into massive overinvestment in transmission. And by the way, that's all it was ever meant to plan. Like its scope has grown terribly, and the claims made are terrible. It's meant to inform transmission planning. If you assume we will build probably 2 to 3 times as much transmission as renewables as is ever possible, you will overspend on your transmission to support that. And so I think the right thing to do with the ISP is to just ignore it. But it takes an awful lot of digging and an awful lot of debate to prove that point and show where it has gone so horribly wrong, because there are thousands of pages used to justify why they have done everything just so right.
Very important that these debates are played out on the floor of the House, though, in my view. You have said, and in fact, Bill Calcraft, a former Wallaby who's spent 50 years building and maintaining renewable assets around the world, when I put it to him, said that he broadly agrees with you, that around 40% renewables, I don't think any of us are against renewables where they make sense. I'm certainly not. I want an energy mix. That's good if you do it sensibly. But once you get beyond about 40%, it's nearly impossible to have a stable grid. Well, stable grid is code for reliable power. You turn the switch and the lights come on. You start your smelter up and the metal is smelted. It doesn't freeze in the pipes. It's the key to us living our lives normally and not having the lights go out in the middle of an operation or between the 23rd and the 24th floor. It's the key to us having a manufacturing basis. What in the ISP do they, or what is in it that suggests that they can maintain grid stability at 82%?
Good question. They would say they've put in enough synchronous condensers. Synchronous condensers is the right word. It's a big spinning flywheel, basically. So we've developed an energy system where we have...
Has anybody heard of those? I mean, what do they look like? How many are we going to have in the country?
That's right. Well, there's 2 or 3 that have been put in South Australia recently, and they're the compensation. We've got used to having a system built out of big spinning machines, and they provide a crucial functionality to keep the grid stable. It's kind of the heartbeat that means the frequency is connected and the whole thing oscillates. It's an AC electricity, alternating current. But we're used to having spinning machines in the system because we always had turbines running. And now, as soon as we try to turn them off, we have to create new artificial spinning machines, synchronous condensers. So that's the answer they have for that.
I thought it was batteries.
Well, it's very difficult with the battery. That's a technology that hasn't properly been developed to get this, they would call grid-forming inverters is the technology they would talk about. Still early days for grid-forming inverters, trying to artificially create this pulse, this kind of alternating current. But I think the bigger problem, though, in the ISP is just this idea about how much it will cost to get there, because the problem about 40% is that at certain points, I mean, because there's peaks and troughs, renewable energy, it goes up and down. At about 40%, your peaks hit the ceiling. And at some point, you've got too much energy in one place at one time, and you've got to start moving it around. And the next investor is kind of like, I can't sell all my energy. I've got to move it to a different place or a different time. And moving energy around is what gets expensive. And so there's not a single point where that becomes critical. It's a ski jump. It just gets harder and harder the further you go. But around 40%, I would agree, is roughly the inflection point where the honeymoon is over. And we're just starting to hit that now. And hence, must spend on all these huge foundational projects like these giant interconnectors between different states, huge renewable energy zones, Snowy Hydro 2.0, massive gigawatt scale batteries, and suddenly realizing we've got to sort of, bid back the control of the renewable assets under everyone's roofs and start turning them off. This is the point where you start to answer all those hard questions. It's as much about trying to not waste the energy and move it around space and time as it is about the stability. But the stability will become a big problem. And already I've heard that South Australia doesn't have the same steadiness in the frequency, and that has an impact on manufacturing. So the problem is there. They've written down the things they think will solve the problem, but the whole system, I think, just hasn't been added up to full cost.
It's worth noting that unless it's changed in the last few months, I saw some research, credible research recently, which revealed that 50% of Australians believe that Australia contributes between 10 and 20% of global emissions. And 30% of Australians think batteries are the answer because they generate electricity. And this is important. It really is, because we're starting off a low base when it gets to the vital need in a democracy for people to understand what is driving their prosperity or their lack thereof, which leads me to the next question. In your wildest dreams, what would it might look like if we were to stabilise or even, dare I say it, reduce electricity prices? We were promised, of course, $275 reduction, whatever, in annual bills. That hasn't happened, and I don't think anybody thinks it's going to. But do you see a way to reasonably priced electricity at all, frankly?
Not quickly. Look, the key to get the costs down is to use all the assets to their maximum capacity. The difficulty is introducing assets that flood in and flood out and come in gushes and streams and rushes that you can't control, because it just means that it's impossible to use any assets to their maximum capacity. So to bring the prices down, prices of electricity paid, you'd probably start by sheeting up a whole bunch of rooftop solar. And so we can get full capacity out of the existing generators. And they'd be able to bid in for more of the total generation. And I think that the power through the wall would probably not stop rising as fast, because we've been demanding it more steadily. So using your assets efficiently is the key to bringing prices down. And we can slow the price rise by stopping to push in things that force us to underutilize all our assets, those uncontrollable renewable energy systems. So we can stop the price rising by stopping that. How to bring it down? Look, the hard answer is that nuclear won't bring it in overnight, won't bring it down overnight. The fact is it would take a number of years to build it. I think that around or hopefully under 10 is probably realistic, but that's not instant change. And the nuclear energy that you produce on the first day, I don't think it's cheaper than coal on the first day. Once you've paid off your initial capital, when you're in that long twilight where you've paid down your capital, then it might be. That's a long-term prospect, a simple mechanism by which you can have very cheap electricity. But the first thing right now we could do to push down power prices would probably be refurb or build some more brown coal in Victoria and maybe something similar in New South Wales as well. There's consensus not to do that, but the hard trade-offs we should be honest about. And so I think that we can stop the price rises by not flooding in the systems that force us to underutilize all the assets that we have in our system, and also the transmission. The transmission is the long-lasting thing. The nice thing about solar panels and wind farms from a long-term planning perspective is that they're only a mistake that lasts for 25 or 20 years. But in terms of transmission, we're going to tear up a lot of the countryside, and these are 45, 50-year assets before you have to kind of recapitalize them, and they really are a permanent impact on rural communities in particular. So these kind of long-term investments, we just need to reconsider how much we do of those right now, because we pay for them. Once you build them, you have to pay for them. They don't come out of the system easily.
It does seem to me to be incredibly important to recognise that the first priority is reliable power. It's no use having affordable power if it's not reliable. You still blow up all your industries. You finish them. They just won't exist. They'll go. And all the jobs and middle prosperity. And I don't know who it was. Was it the CIS? One of the economic think tanks recently said that on the current trajectory, Australia will slip from being the 12th largest economy in the world to the 25th over the next 15 years. We're not being told the truth. Another area where we're not being told that nobody is elaborating on the reality, because they don't want people focused on the next ugly set of issues coming at us, is that electricity production's only around 36% of your greenhouse emissions. I'm a farmer. Agriculture's 14%, transport's 14%. Add the two together and talk about the food on your plate, it probably comes to almost as much as electricity. Then you've got cement production. Then you've got steel production. What are we going to do about them? You know, we've lifted, David Boyd and I have been involved in agriculture for you a little longer than me, but not much, a long time. And we've, over the last 50 years, I mean, we just talk everything so negatively, don't we? 5 billion extra mouths being properly fed every day by the world's farmers. Ironically, no one talks about it, but the greening of the planet is pushing food production up. And for the last 10 years, the globe's farmers have produced enough food every year for 10 billion people in a world of 8 billion. No one needs to go hungry. It's only corruption and broken infrastructure, and the two are often related, that results in people going hungry. But that remarkable achievement has been done on the back of research extension around the world, largely by the West, and Australia's been one of the 7 heavy hitters in that work. We ought to be proud of that. It's an incredible achievement. 6 nations and the Gates Foundation. But basically making that stuff available to third world farmers, lifting people out of poverty. It's been done on the back of a global order overseen by the Americans that is now being dismantled and challenged at every point. And guess what the other one is? Available and affordable energy. And those people, the estimates are that if oil extinction had their way, what do they call themselves? Just stop oil. Well, if we just stopped oil now, 4 or 5 billion people would be hungry, just like the Sri Lankans were, in no time at all. That's a moral good as well as saving the planet, but no one ever talks about it. There are serious trade-offs that have got to be considered. And Australians, we're being so insulted. The latest one is, oh, we couldn't be clever enough to have a nuclear industry here. I don't know about you, but I'm really offended by that. Apparently, by the way, we can have nuclear submarines, but there we go. Anyway, here's the living proof that we can do it. How long realistically, if Australians said, we've had enough of this, we're going to vote the coalition in, we're going to actually insist on a Senate that's workable instead of jamming the system, we want the ban lifted, assuming all that were possible, so we had the national willpower, how long do you think it would take to get that first couple up? After that, it would accelerate quickly, as you've said. I'm sure we all believe that. How long would it really take? Because the big argument's being advanced at the moment, I'm sure you've heard, oh, it's too late. It won't save us. It won't save the planet. Well, we're not going to reach the existing targets. It's not going to happen. So the question is, how do you meet the targets? And I don't see personally how you can do it without nuclear. But a feel for how long you really think it would take to build the expertise and to get a plant up and operating.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Everyone's hanging on this. Just for context, though, I mean, the first private, fully developed nuclear power plant that wasn't a recommissioned naval reactor in the United States took about 4 years. Private companies, first built new company to build a working nuclear power station. So a lot's happened for us to go from that as a starting point to now be talking about 10, 15 years. And look, maybe it's good that we've made them a whole lot safer and better regulated in certain ways. That can be overdone. There's very credible arguments to say that you can use regulation to stifle it as well. But look, in the West, we shouldn't have to take more than around, 10 years and hopefully much less. The Asians do it regularly in 4 to 6. So it clearly can be done. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, first time off the bat, spent around about 12 years from the decision to go nuclear, all the planning, preparation, engaging a partner, to having first electricity on the grid. I mean, I think we should aim for at least that. I mean, if the Emiratis can do it, why should we not? And I think that in Australia's case, with the current proposal on the table, it's really a political question about whether we pull our finger out and do it. If Australians really voted and said clearly, we do want this. I mean, if we have a referendum, it's been called on now by both parties. They've said, we're going to have a referendum on nuclear energy. It's going to be the next election. If Australians say, guess what? We want it. And some party is voted out of office on the basis of that. Can you imagine all the other state governments and everyone else saying, oh, you know what? I think we'll go against the Australian people on the referendum we just had and we'll hope to hang on our office. I think that if the political problem is solved, all the other regulatory problems and legal problems and institutional problems will fall extremely quickly. Now, that's a big if. the politics will be hard. It'll be a hard-fought battle, I'm sure. But if Australians really voted and showed that's what they wanted, I think we would roll it out remarkably quickly, and we should aim to do no worse than what's happened in the first embarking country. We have a stronger foundation. We've got ANSTO, one of the most respected medical research reactors in the world. We do have regulations. We're getting nuclear submarines. So we're not at a cold start, and other perfect cold standing start countries can do it in 12 for making the decision. So the building should be less than that, I think.
One last one before I throw open to the room. Safety and waste, your thoughts?
Look, if you are really worried about safety and waste, there is no better energy source than nuclear. It's an absolute dream come true to have so much energy to power cities, and have it sitting at the end in a solid block that has produced so much energy you can afford to engineer the heck out of any containment that you want to, and it just sits there and goes nowhere. Like every other type of waste is worse, that's in some sort of liquid or some bulky thing, or infused with fine minerals through different wafers and composites. But just having such a tiny amount of waste in such a solid block it's absolutely the best, because you can contain it so well. Not a single person ever harmed by radiation from nuclear waste. All right, we've had a few accidents. The accidents, by the way, not a single person outside Chernobyl harmed outside of the actual power station itself. All right, so 3 Mile Island, no one harmed, working there or not. No one was harmed, had any ill effects from radiation. 3 Mile Island. Chernobyl, one person had linked cancer-related death years later, and a person working there who was doing some brave stuff, measuring all the people in all the places. But there has been no deaths to civilians outside that single accident at Chernobyl from nuclear power. And that reactor design has never been approved in the West. We'd never build it today. It's physically impossible for that particular type of explosion, where the explosion came from inside the fuel itself. That's how it started. Nuclear reactors today can't do that. The bad accidents are called a meltdown because they can't blow up the way that Chernobyl did. So I just think that safety, waste, you couldn't hope for a better record than what nuclear power has had. And it's just such an excellent engineering opportunity to have it so containable and so tractable.
Over to you. Who wants to kick it off? Sir.
John, to your last comment on the damage that's being done to our economy, has anyone counted up the jobs that have been lost? Who's counting?
It's a very good question. It's a difficult number to count, Rafe, because we have so many, it's one of those multivariable analyses where you can point at different factors and say, was it this or was it that? But I mean, there's no doubt in energy and metals processing, refinement, etc., that we are already seeing the impact of that. Western Australia, in particular, at the moment, I know that they actually very large gold mines, in fact, get paid to not mine gold when there's not enough power for them to run their heavy machinery. So we literally pay them to leave the gold in the ground. So the economic destruction being done. Look, my word, someone should add it up. It's very difficult to, but it's a complex problem to count with accuracy.
Yes?
Thank you very much. My name's Josh O'Rourke. I work for the company that runs the supercritical power station at Cogan Creek that you mentioned. I read the report that you put out, and it was so good that I travelled down from Brisbane to hear you, because it's incredible work that you've done, so I strongly commend you for it. My question to you as an analyst, and to John as a former minister, I want to talk about a carbon price, right? So we're facing huge costs in terms of the subsidies that we're putting into this. The market is just completely messed up in more ways than one can count. Would we have been better off if we'd had the carbon price from 2012 to let the market guide us, rather than having a bunch of Soviet-style interventions and subsidies?
Do you want to start, John?
No, over you. I'll give you my absolutely honest answer, and some of my former colleagues won't like it much. I think a carbon price, and let the market sort out how they were going to do it, ultimately would have been a better way if it had been applied properly globally. That's the problem. I don't think I can put it much more succinctly than that. I think the only other thing, and that was never going to happen, because those countries that have not yet been able to lift themselves out of poverty are just not going to buy this stuff. They won't buy it. And I don't blame them, frankly. I really don't. So it was always a very difficult ask. Now we've got the mess that we've got, I just say that we've got to unravel the ideology. Remember what I said at the beginning. We have to get to a point where the real interests of the Australian people are put in front of ideology, and that begins with the facts, which is why what you're doing here is so unbelievably important.
Thanks so much for coming. I think it's a very good question. The simple answer is yes. We'd be better off with a carbon price than the mess we've ended up with right now. And I think that transparency is key. Information, market signals is key. I mean, it's a strong theme, I think, in Centre for Independent Studies. We're committed to seeking market solutions and letting the market do what it does best. And in the case of what's happening today, we're ending up with, I think, the very worst of all worlds possible, where we're trying to create a system that will basically intervene in the least possible transparent ways to kind of force a particular outcome. And it will and does end badly. And we've written a paper recently, the value of emissions reductions. It's probably sitting right here, and I just recommend it to you, the impact of a shadow carbon price. Not wanting to say there should not be a price on carbon, but the way we've done it in Australia, where we've introduced it by a determination of the ministers that says they will just pick the price and not give it to all the public, not to give it to companies, but insert it into the deepest, darkest depths of the regulatory system so that the bureaucrats can assess a business case from a regulated monopoly to say, can we charge consumers to build this thing, which nobody looks at. Like, nobody scrutinised this properly, except, by the way, the team at CIS. You guys are, but almost no one does. So we've ended up in a system where we've created the least transparent, most narrowly convoluted, bureaucratically implemented things, rather than a broad signal that can be transparently interpreted by a competitive market to find the best way to respond. So my simple answer is yes, that would be much better than what we've ended up with.
Madam.
I spent about 10 years of my life on the board of transmission authorities in both Tasmania and Victoria. And as an economist, I've always been interested in price. So you've got your 6 things in that paper, and we hear them say renewables are going to be lower. So one thing we can look at is we can look at South Australia, because South Australia currently has the highest electricity prices. And on many days, they have prices around 180 or something. And we in Victoria provide them with power. And that actually transfers the high prices to Victoria. And so my thing is that Victoria's price of electricity is currently based on the wind in South Australia. And if you go into AEMO and watch that, it really is interesting. And the other thing, a long time ago, somebody said about wind, when it is hot, it's only at 7%. And I always thought they were being tough on wind because I was on a board where people didn't care too much about renewables, except me. And I always thought about that. But if you look at some of the wind generation, in some of the hot weather, 7 or 8% is somewhere how it ends up. But anyway, in Victoria, we've had a very cold June. And when you look at how much the wind is blowing, it's at about 7%. But nobody's ever said to us before, well, perhaps when it's cold, the wind doesn't work as well. So they're just some thoughts of where you might go with it, and especially about the price.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very valuable. Just to add a little rider, you asked about the cost of all of this. I'm not here to spruik another think tank, but the Page is the National Party's think tank, and we're just looking for some support for the moment to do that very thing, to try and work out what industries have been lost or damaged as a result of unreliable and more expensive power. We are going to try and get a bit of a handle on that because we think it's part of what Australians should know. All these things are a trade-off. People have got to know and understand. I mean, is there anyone here who doubts that the crisis over the cost of living at the moment is largely related to the cost of power? Of course it is. Does anybody think, you've heard it from Aidan, that there's any relief in sight for that? Well, the Australian people need to be told the truth. It's a free country. If you think we ought to have more expensive power so that we all live more simply, Mr. Brandt and others, just tell us.
Nigel Stoke. I wanted to ask a political question. I wanted to start globally and then think about Australia. But if we look at the figures that you just talked about, 2 billion still around the world with unreliable energy, and secondly, the quantum of energy that's needed, which is not electricity, and then you look at the numbers, which is mid-80s, whatever it is, 80% or something are still fossil fuels around the world, and it's dropping off a couple of percentage points at the moment every 5 years or something like that. But there's still obviously global growth, global prosperity. You've described that very well. So globally, politically, we've got United Nations man standing up telling us that we're all going to fall off a cliff in a very short time. What can we do about that? How can we influence that? I'm thinking about your roles in a prior life in terms of what should Australia be saying on the global stage, because that might help communicate some of the daft stuff that we're seeing around the country here.
Well, I've always thought, like Alexander Downer, that Australia, whilst not a super player, is a significant country and one that was respected and that can give a lead. And I would have thought in energy, the first thing you do is to say, well, the best way we can help you transit to a better world and make sure that everybody's properly fed and lifespans, which have doubled or maintained and what have you, is to use our relatively clean coal. The last coal used in the world, while ever the world's using coal, ought to be some of the cleanest Australian coal. You all realise calorifically it's much more productive than filthy coal out of a lot of Chinese or Indonesian. I'm not being rude about those countries. I'm just saying our coal's much cleaner. But that's logic, isn't it? But we ought to be taking a leadership role there. Use our coal, it's clean. And that helps them transit. How much emissions have we saved globally by exporting gas? Australia and Qatar can export a lot of gas. Europe now describes it as a clean fuel. Here in Australia, it's still being demonised. So I think the answer is that we've lost the intellectual and moral muscle tone to be able to lead. And I find that really, as a sixth-generation Australian, tragic. And I think we ought to try and recover it somehow. And I'm encouraged that not everyone, don't take offence if you're like me, not everyone in this room has silver-coloured hair. We've got leaders coming up. And everything we can do to put wind in your sails and to try and recreate that capacity for leading our own country well and playing a responsible role on the global stage, so much the better, because it has to be said that, we're not the only country in crisis at the moment, and we've got a lot of opponents who think we're losing our way, and at the moment we seem to be determined to prove them right.
I want to comment on that as well, because I think it's just so important when you look at what the global emissions are and how many other countries that are younger and hungrier than we are and what they burn for fuel currently. Australia does nothing globally really to help solve climate change if it doesn't scale. If it's not a model that you can export to other places that are younger and hungrier than we are and say, this is how it might work. And the thing that I just think is so funny now in the last, let's say, month or so, the argument that's come up is that Australia is the only country in the world in which renewables might work, and therefore we should pioneer that path, that definitely we can't export to anywhere else because they don't have our blessings of renewables. I just think that's such an absurd... I thought
we could send it to Singapore.
And how's that gone? Exactly my point, right? The idea that we can somehow provide something of value in terms of a guidance by exploiting our unmatched space and landmass is just so strange. We should be walking first in a path that others can tread in, that actually works well. And I just think it's so obvious that we should show what a sophisticated, well-educated, we think, country can build in this country. And we can build a perfectly clean, perfectly reliable energy system, which, would work fine in every country in the world. And so I just think it's such a simple thing. We should not be ruining our opportunity to pave a path that others can follow in by developing nuclear.
Here's an interesting little illustration of why that should be feasible and why we should aspire to it. It brings me great pride and satisfaction as an Australian farmer still enmeshed in agricultural research, but that no country exports a higher percentage of its agricultural production than Australia. We feed many, many people over and above our own population. Here's a little thing that not many people would know. Our expertise and our scientific knowledge feeds a lot more people than our food experts. Why not try and find a parallel when it comes to modern energy systems? But I know we're too dumb. We couldn't build a nuclear industry because we don't have enough trained people. As I said before, how bloody insulting. What's the matter with us? What would our forefathers have said? I'll go 1, 2, and then, oh, golly. Simon, I might have to get you to take over. You make the enemies, not me. Tim.
Thank you, John. That's appreciated. There's a lot of self-loathing at the bottom of this, isn't there?
Yeah.
I've got a question for both of you on the same topic. So, Aidan, you said this fight's going to be political and very difficult, and then you mentioned the cost of the nuclear option. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how that's framed. And then, John, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how the politics is framed, because obviously this will be vicious. Do you have any suggestions about how this might be framed, particularly noting the impact in the regions of the renewable industry?
Look, I'll start with the question about the politics. I think you're absolutely right. This political fight will be crucial, and I think that costs are kind of one of the last and most important bastions of actual debate here. And I think the way to win that argument is probably not now to focus too much on the costs of nuclear, but to get the jolly honest picture, the full proper picture of what the renewable-only energy system actually costs. Because I think that, frankly, we've already got to the point where CSIRO's lower bound is sort of only around $150 per megawatt hour, which is not, as we'd like it lower than that for sure. But I think that very realistically you can see it's going to get to 130 or something like that. It won't necessarily fall easily too far below. But when you compare that to the alternative, if we were honest about it, I don't think we'd give a damn about whether it's 100 or 110 or 120 or 130, because I think the alternative is going to be probably still something like double what they currently estimate. So, I mean, if we get a clear picture on that half of the debate, the problem is, as you know well, I think that the huge lengths have been gone to make sure there is not a clear picture on what the current cost is for the renewable energy system. So, I mean, give us 6 months and we'll see what we can do in that space. But the costs are crucial, and I think that uncovering the true cost of the renewable energy system is where all guns need to be trained right now.
I agree with that. We've got to get people to understand that the road we're on at the moment is a road to unreliable power, which is industry busting, and unaffordable power, which is industry busting and household busting. It will be a long and hard and convoluted debate. It will require a great deal of skill. I am very pro think tanking, and which is why I'm so pro what the CIS and others are doing, because I think it's so difficult to have a logical political debate in today's environment. It's so vicious. It's so nasty. It's so short term, such poor attention spans, that you have to have quality thinking being promoted by think tanks, which is where you can all play a role. And there is a parallel for it. Britain in the 1970s, on its knees, 2 think tanks in particular started to say all sorts of unsayable things about what needed to be done in Great Britain to break the cycle of decline, if I can put it that way. The great beneficiary was Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet in 1978. And, of course, it turned Britain around. Pity they've lost their way again, says this Anglophile. Well, they have. A certain government was still standing on their shoulders in terms of debt to GDP. We think it's bad, and it is bad, and it is exploding badly, but heavily, but rapidly. Still nothing like Britain's. Britain's unfunded pension liabilities going forward, for example, are about 60% of GDP. Ours are 1 or 2. Down the back, and then over here.
So you've actually headed down the same direction I'm heading. So my issue is, how do we educate Australians? So the issue I've got is a vested interest, and the billionaires and millionaires that are using taxpayers' money to get rich, and the conflicts of interest, and how do we expose it? Well, we've got a wind drought now. Renewables have failed everywhere in the world. We've got to get the messaging right. The messaging is so important, but the media are not on our side. The media are against us, the politicians are against us. Even the Liberal Party have people that support renewables. How do we change the messaging?
Well, we start here in this room. You start with high quality information. You've got to, this is John Howard was brilliant at this. John Howard could distill out, if you like, the intellectual arguments in a way that meshed with people's lived experiences. And, that's what the coalition's going to have to do. There's no option. But we all have to be engaged at too, in the pubs and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm just astounded. One of the brightest members of my own family the other day said, nuclear can't add up. Look what the CSIRO said. I said, you're a business analyst. Go and read the thing. So we have got a major problem. I know he's now Sir Neil Ferguson out here later, and that's terrific. I'm a great admirer. But he would simply make the point that our universities have become treasonous and you've got to start again. And he's doing that with Barry Weiss, of course, in Austin, Texas, a new university dedicated to real inquiry and contestability of ideas. Let me tell you what I really think. We are at a civilizational moment in the West. We are at a civilizational moment. And I'm not sure we're going to make it, but I don't want to be questioned for want of trying, and I don't think anybody else in this room does either. Let's realise the stakes are very great. Who'd like to direct? Yeah, go, sir.
Thank you. Essentially, currently, we cannot process the waste even from a small reactor that produces medical isotopes for use. Currently, there's still a huge amount stored on the original site from the original reactor that has not been processed or particularly stored safely if you speak to people who work there. I believe the High Court ruled against the federal government's appeal to store waste at an old South Australian defence facility. I'd like anyone to correct me if I'm wrong. So essentially, we don't have approval to store the waste, even if it's made into these briquettes from the Synrock process. If that's the case, if we extrapolate to 7 plants with 4 units each, and we have a major contribution to the power, let's say 10% of the total grid, how are we going to store waste safely? It's not true to say that it's stored safely currently. That's quite a misnomer.
I think I'd like to take a stab at how to answer that question. We store waste by just deciding to do it. It's not technically challenging to store it safely. No, I don't think that's an admission that it doesn't work and we don't have a solution. And in fact, I know there's someone from ANSTO in the room I can direct you to later to discuss in detail what happens for our waste. But I also know the technology that's been developed to store it in a solid, which is the dream for waste, is an incredible Australian innovation. And for nuclear power, if we decide to, I mean, just look it up online. Decide to look at how much waste is produced from decades of multi-gigawatt sites. It just fits in a space that's like a small car park, a couple of tennis courts, and it just sits there forever. So I just think that the solution is there. We need to decide to what we do with the waste, of course, but it's a political problem. It's not a technical problem. The waste site for low-level waste at Kimber could have been approved. The federal government decided not to appeal the original decision, which was given against on a technicality, because it was convenient for them to let the narrative run that it was hard to store the waste. So waste can be stored. It's technically very doable. It's just a question of deciding to do it.
Yes, in the red. I thought I saw your hand up earlier, and I wanted to honour that.
The renewable energy target comes off in 2030, I understand. And then what happens after that? Hasn't the federal government guaranteed all sorts of things that are going to be hard to unwind?
Yes, indeed. So the renewable energy target, for those that you don't know, is a mandate that all your power companies, everyone you buy power from, have to get a certain percentage of their energy from renewable energy sources. So that is a subsidy of sorts. It just forces us to pay whatever premium is required to deliver that. That's about to wind up, and the replacement is a underwriting of revenue the total value of which is not known. So the government is currently, this is called the Capacity Investment Scheme, where the government has said we will guarantee you a floor and a cap on your revenues, which is just, is literally a blank check for renewable energy, because we know that their revenues will decline the more they cannibalize each other's share. So when the sun's all sunny together, no one gets paid well for producing more power then. So there's been basically a blank check. Well, they've said there's a limit somewhere. They just won't tell us what it is. There's no understanding about what the total cost of this scheme is. So I think we've ended up in a sad place indeed, where we just have got to the point where the insistence we must have more of this power is persuading the government they just must pretty much get ready to write blank checks to force it into the system. I think it's a very sorry situation indeed.
Look, I'm going to have to out myself as something of a skeptic in many respects, and not a climate change heretic, not a climate change skeptic, but I'm very skeptical in general when the government tells me that something is settled and that their numbers are always right and that we shouldn't ever question what they're doing. And I think one of the most important things that we've heard about tonight, and one of the most important things that Aidan and his team have been doing since they joined the CIS 6 months ago, is they've been asking the questions that the people putting the numbers together should have asked before they released them. And even if whatever your position is on climate change, whatever your position is on renewable energy, whatever your position is on the transition, everyone should agree that the most important thing is that we get the numbers right before we start. And what we are seeing time and time again is that not only the numbers not right, the numbers are not even there. But just join me, please, in thanking Aidan and John for their excellent contribution.
Well done.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.